Morning, everyone. Good afternoon to those joining from Africa, and welcome to our monthly Africa-US Forum. And the topic today is Africa and climate change. We're going to have people joining. My goodness, I see people joining from the West Coast. We're at 6 in the morning. So people will be joining as we get underway. These monthly programs feature speakers from around the African continent in dialogue with experts here in the United States. And our next forum is Monday, September 25th, also at 9 a.m. And the topic will be business and trade. So September 25th, right here. These monthly programs are presented by a group of partners, including the African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. And Bob Wekesa in the top left there actually is going to be here in person, but had something which is keeping him in another part of Washington, D.C. So but Bob is representing the African Center for the Study of the U.S. The Annenberg Center for Communication, Leadership, and Policy of USC, that's Judy and me, and Alicia Pratt. The Center for African Studies from Howard University, the Institute for African Studies from George Washington University, and the Public Diplomacy Council of America. And Dan Whitman is here, PDCA. You have speaker bios in front of you, so you know who the speakers are going to be. And so to give the speakers more time and more time for conversation, I'm going to turn things over to today's moderator, Bob Wekesa. Bob.
Thank you very much, Adam, and thank you very much, colleagues from wherever you are joining in from our USC building, where you are right there physically. I think Adam was being polite. It is that I have an issue with of health nature. Being candid, I have some kind of arthritis issue, so I can't even walk. But I'm here. The rest of my body is working perfectly. It is in harmony with you guys. Otherwise, I'm here in DC, and I'm happy to moderate this event. I suppose the big top line entry into this topic is that climate change matters have grown meteorically to become the key issues of concern for development, with linkages to just about everything from migration to war and so forth. And that is a global development. They pose an existential threat to humanity. But I think there's consensus that Africa has borne the brunt of much of the negative impacts and consequences of climate change. I think the lamentation by African leaders, businesses, people, and so forth is their contribution to climate-related negative effects, like the depletion of the ozone layer, is very small. They have a very small footprint. We do not burn too much of the hydrocarbons, neither are we a major manufacturing region of the world. The people polluting the most are, in fact, in this country and in China and more in the development world. But when we look at the impact, we are the ones who are facing flooding, facing famines. Countries such as Somalia, for example, have had famines rolling for nearly 5 years, every single year for 5 years. And that's generally the Horn of Africa for you. And of course, in recent times, we've seen that the coups that we're witnessing, the 11 coups that we witnessed over the last couple of years, are quite linked to issues of climate change, which has itself a linkage to resource scarcity, which leads to violence, which leads to migration, with lots of people, thousands of Africans, ending up in the Mediterranean Sea, with ships capsizing and so forth. So in a nutshell, there are many problems, and there have equally been many proposals for ameliorative action at the UN level, at the regional level. These have included governance models and governance frameworks, There's been the question of just energy transition, for example, that Africans want to actually light up the continent, for example, in terms of electricity. But what do? Do we go to hydrocarbons, which are said to be the cause of much of the pollution, or do we go to clean energy, which is expensive, which we can't afford, and so forth? So therefore, the notion of a just energy transition. To help us understand, delve into today's topic, we have two eminent colleagues, and actually they are colleagues of mine as well. I'm glad at a personal level, because one of our speakers who is joining us virtually is Ochieng Ogodo, who was a colleague of mine at a newspaper in Nairobi called The Standard, and I have very nostalgic memories of that. Ochieng is a Nairobi-based award-winning science journalist and consulting editor. He's a member of the executive board of the World Federation of Science Journalists and the patron of Kenya Environment and Science Journalists Association. He is immediate former regional coordinator and editor for the UK-based Science Development Network for Sub-Saharan Africa. And he was the 2008 Reuters IUCN Media Awards in Excellence in Environmental Reporting for English-speaking Africa and Middle East. And of course, Ochieng is joining us from Nairobi, which is the headquarters of the United Nations Environmental Program, as well as UN Habitat, which are the regional UN agencies there. And in addition, so we'll hear from Ochieng, and then we'll move on to Ambassador Charles Ray, who is also a close colleague of mine. He's former US Foreign Service officer, retired in 2012 after 30 years of service. Prior to joining the Foreign Service, he spent 20 years in the US Army, retiring with the rank of Major. During his Army career, he did the tours of duty in Vietnam and served in the military intelligence, special operations, and other areas of the military. He served in ambassadorial positions, or diplomatic positions for that matter, in China, in Thailand, in Sierra Leone, in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Zimbabwe, serving as ambassador in Zimbabwe, which is in the news, by the way. And so perhaps, I don't know if there's a climate link there, but it will be interesting to consider. Ambassador Ray is a trustee and chair of the Africa program of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, which I think for those of us who are Africanists or follow African matters, has in the recent time risen to be a major platform for debate on issues to do with Africa and the US. And I think that is thanks to Ambassador Ray's great effort in setting up the Africa program of FPRI. So without further ado, I will ask Ochieng Ogodo to start us off with perhaps 5 or so minutes of a big introduction into the topic. We did share the questions with or the issues for that matter with the speakers and gave them the latitude to delve in as they see fit. And so Ochieng, maybe you can start us off, then we'll come on to Ambassador Ray.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, colleagues. It's a good afternoon in Nairobi. I know it's a good morning in America, in most parts of America. As Bob has said, my name is Ochieng, and I'm a journalist by profession, having been in the trade for the last 27 years, 16 of which have been spent pretty much on science journalism. And what I want to talk about is the place that I have competence in, and that's the nexus between media and climate change. Because I believe, and probably you will agree with me, that the media has a critical role to play when it comes to climate change issues, particularly in Africa, that is so much hard hit, but has really not produced so much greenhouse gases that are responsible for the situation that we are in today. So I think there's a big connection between climate change issues as well as related impacts on the media itself when it comes to shaping public opinion, when it comes to raising awareness, when it comes to debunking disinformation and misinformation that pretty much is found within the corridors of those who do not believe in climate change. And apart from that one, driving a meaningful action, if the global community or the African community has to take any meaningful action, then I think the media has to be right in the middle of it, so that there is the link between science, there is the link with the public discourse, there is the link with research and development, as well as the link with policy making processes insofar as climate change issues are concerned. And I think when it comes to information dissemination, then the media has the power to prioritize climate change issues and put them right at the center of public discourse, so that at the end of the day, we can end up with informed choices on what needs to be done to address the situation that we find ourselves in. So I think that's a very important role that the media has to play. And because of time, I'm going to move a little bit fast. The other point that I think is important is the agenda setting. That the media has the ability to set the agenda and influence public discourses. And this one can be done by continually highlighting climate change issues, whether they are economical, whether they are social, whether they are environmental, then that becomes pretty much important for the media to do. And I think besides that, there is also the shaping of the narrative itself. How do we frame the narrative so that it becomes quite topical? It becomes an issue of concern for both the ordinary people as well as those in development organizations, government policy corridors, in research and development as well. So I think that is very important for the media. And the other thing that I think is important is getting public engagement when it comes to climate change issues. How do you really reach the public, even if you have the information, and draw them into a conversation that is useful for dealing with climate change issues and related impacts, whether they are flooding, whether they are droughts, whether they are bushfires caused as a result of climate change. So I think that is very important to do. So you need to get the public, and the best way to get the public in the discourse is by engaging with the media, because they've got a wider reach, and they are also trusted. Although I may use the word trust with a little bit of consideration, but I think the people believe in the media, the policies makers believe in the media, the general public believe in the media, and therefore, if you bring the media to the table where issues like this are taking place, then I think you've got an extra or an added advantage in engaging with the public. It's a platform that stands in between the public and different segments of the discourse itself. So I think that is absolutely important. And then there's also the issue of advocacy for climate change. We do say in the media world that we don't do advocacy, but when you look at it critically, you will find that the things we do within the media itself also amounts to advocacy in trying to call for certain actions that needs to be done. Of course, when it comes to climate change, there are actions that needs to be done, and there's no otherwise about them. And the media has the role to do the advocacy, like when you want to lower the greenhouse gas emissions, we have to advocate for that. So that is very important. The other point that I want to talk about, probably the second last point, is collaboration and knowledge exchange or knowledge brokerage. The media has a role to collaborate with climate experts, civil society, government policymakers, development organizations, and ensure that there's an exchange of knowledge between these organizations as well as the general public in making people embrace different ideas, different scientific information that is available so that people engage. So that is a very important role that the media needs to play. And I think this also the issue of networking and the floorboard for learning. The media has a role to play in doing a lot of networking and also helping people to make what I would call informed choices. We don't need to tell people what choices they should have, but we need to help them make very informed choices through accurate, analytical, evidence-based reporting, and getting it from the scientific community into the public discourse. So I think those are very important things. And since you gave me only 5 minutes, which I think probably I am on or I've exceeded, I will stop from there. And if there are if there's any question or anything further on that, then I'll be available to give my insights. Thank you so much, Bob.
Thank you, Ochieng. And I think that's a big introduction. You've really touched on some of the big points. I think, related to media and communication. I believe as we go into the second round of questions, you'll help us put some real details, examples on the ground, on the continent that you've engaged with, across the advocacy that you talk about, publicity and raising the stature of climate change in, various parts of the continent. I think we'll get to hear that. I also needed to point out that to our American colleagues, I think I might have not recognized that the US itself and the American continent, as it were, the Americas, is also facing its own challenges, just like the rest of the world. I think we've seen heat waves here in the US touching record highs for the first time. And our US-Africa forum, this series, is actually a conversation between US and Africa. So it was, I think I skipped the American end of things, but really we want to look at the environmental challenges on either side in a comparative kind of way and so forth. So I suppose that's one thing that we can put in mind even during the interactive session that we're going to have in this session. But without further ado, I would like to now invite Ambassador Charles Ray to make his big entry, intervention here. Thanks.
Thanks, Bob. I will try to be not quite so big. To steal a line from one of my Western characters, I will ride small in the saddle. You've actually taken some of my thunder, because I was going to start by saying torrential rains causing floods in places like Vermont and Kentucky, prolonged droughts, and high winds from storms that are fueled by climate change, creating wildfires, not just here in the US, but in Canada and in Europe. And the heat waves, unprecedented heat waves, which introduced to Americans the term urban heat island, have brought to Europe and to North America a realization that people of Africa have lived with for decades, and that is that climate change is real, and that the impacts of climate change are not just dangerous and devastating, but deadly. You've heard some of the things that impact the continent of Africa, droughts and floods, which have affected agricultural production and food security, causing dislocation of populations in areas that are already suffering from food insecurity, that have fueled violence, droughts which have caused conflicts between herders and farmers over grazing lands, that have caused conflicts between people as they move from one area to another looking for ways to continue to survive. And the fact that Africa is has the fastest rate of urbanization on the planet, which is being further accelerated by the impact of climate change, forcing rural people to move into urban areas in seeking livelihoods, but in fact causing them to go into even worse poverty-stricken conditions because of the fact that most urban centers on the continent are not equipped to deal with the large influx of people, and the construction of a lot of these urban areas, especially the slums surrounding cities, create urban heat islands, which cause even more damage to people than they would have faced other than starvation in the rural areas. And Bob said it in his introduction, even though Africa is about 16% of the world's population, it accounts for a single-digit percentage of carbon emissions annually, but the continent suffers more than any other populated continent on the planet from the impacts of climate change. Severe storms on Africa's east coast from warming seas, more desertification, more areas, agricultural production production is lost due to either flooding or droughts. And the massive dislocation of populations, not just within the continent, but from Africa across the Mediterranean into Southern Europe, all impacted by climate change. The rise in extremism caused by unsettled conditions in areas. And there are a number of things that at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and our research on African issues that we've proposed that need to be done to mitigate the impact of climate change on the continent. One, there needs to be consideration of better design or redesign of urban areas to take into account people movements fueled by climate change, so that when people move into urban areas, they're not moving from one pocket of poverty to another, but moving into an area where they can actually thrive. There needs to be emphasis on sustainable agricultural growth across the continent. By 2050, 60+% of Africa will be urban-based, as opposed to when I first went to Africa in 1996, 80% was rural. As you get a declining rural population, a declining agricultural workforce, there needs to be sustainable, productive ways for the continent to produce the food that it needs in order to have food security. There needs to be better access to climate and weather information for agricultural workers, especially women who make up the bulk of the agricultural workforce on the continent. And finally, the countries of Africa need to work together to find combined solutions to a problem that faces them all, and how to coordinate outside assistance to the continent to provide African solutions to the problem of climate change in a way that benefits us all. And I will, as the previous speaker said, try to answer any questions you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ray. I think you helped us understand the nexus and the connections and the linkages between climate change and just about everything from health to urbanization and so forth. And in fact, as you are speaking, one of the things that we've done as the US Africa series, this event that we're attending and our partners, one of our areas of focus has been diplomacy. And as you're speaking about urbanization, I was thinking along the lines of city diplomacy. I think perhaps this is an area where the African counterparts, African continent can borrow a leaf, because in the US now we have an official responsible for subnational diplomacy at the Department of State. I don't think we have the same on the African continent yet, as you rightly put it. urbanization is happening very rapidly on the continent. As I was mentioning to a colleague only the other day, we now have cities such as Dar es Salaam reaching about, approaching 10 million people, Nairobi going to about 6-7 million people, Johannesburg, 5 million. It's estimated that cities such as Kinshasa are going to approach 20 million people, almost on par with Lagos in the not too distant future. And therefore, city management linked to environmental, so the linking of city and environmental diplomacy will be perhaps an area in which the US and African continent can work together. And I suppose as we go into September, which is the United Nations General Assembly, this is a discussion that we can perhaps expound on. But without delving into this too much, I would like to just go back to my colleague Ochieng Ogodo and ask a very pointed question. If you could perhaps provide some of the examples of how matters environment can be approached scientifically, some of the examples you've seen, how advocacy can be done. And I'm saying this in the context of matters environment or climate change in the past having been seen as elite. So that, everyday Africans see those as issues that are too far away because they are conference issues in Paris and so forth. Yet there's crop failure on their own farms and so forth. So I think if you can give us some examples, that will help us, get down to some of the details. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. I think if you look, for instance, in Africa, there are areas that used to be known to be malaria prone and areas that were known not to be malaria prone. I mean, for instance, Nairobi, which is basically on higher altitude, if I may call it that, was not known for malaria. But today, you find that the mosquitoes that cause malaria have moved to areas that are higher. And the reason being because of the warm climate that makes it feasible for them to stay in those areas. And the net impact of this is that there's an upsurge in malaria cases in places that were generally not known to be malaria prone. So that is one good example that tells you what the changing climate has done to health itself. I think about 4 years ago, we had the cyclone in Southern Africa that stretched from Mozambique to Zimbabwe. And that's not something that is known for Africa. We have cyclones from very far away lands like in the Americas and probably some parts of Asia, but not Africa. But the fact that we can now have experienced that is telling you that the impact of climate change is so huge in Africa itself. And when that one did happen, there was a massive destruction of the infrastructure, both in Mozambique and Zimbabwe. And the reason is because, first of all, our infrastructure, the physical infrastructure is not built to accommodate these kind of changes because we've had a certain kind of climate that did guarantee us not to see things like massive flooding that would come and sweep roads away, sweep bridges away, destroy houses or buildings. So these are things that we are now witnessing, and it calls for a new way of thinking, a new way of addressing the issue of climate change within the continent itself. So that is very, very important. Well, we know one time when I went to do a story on climate change in a place in Eastern Kenya, then one old lady who was about 75 years old told me that, young man, I think the sun has moved closer to the earth. We didn't have this kind of heat long before. And she was talking to me from the point of experience. So the fact that we can have that kind of heat is a clear demonstration of what has happened over the years when it comes to climate change. So that is a very fundamental point. And we have crop failures. When you, I mean, currently one of the biggest concerns within the continent is the food security. And part of the reasons for the food insecurity in the continent is because of lack of bumper harvests, even in places that were really known for that, like Zambia, like some parts of Kenya, parts of Uganda. So you find that the production level has gone down, and the net effect of this one is the unavailability of food crops that people depend on, especially the staple ones. So that explains to you why this need to think about the environment and to think about climate change. And a lot of times we have had these areas looked at for academic reasons. What I do mean by that one is that they are done there and they're left with the academicians. They don't go down to the people. So there's lack of engagement, there's lack of information on people knowing what to do. And I think that is a very important point that we need to consider going forward if Africa has to address climate change impacts. And we may talk about things happening in Paris, happening in meetings, but we need to be very practical on the ground in addressing this issue. And therefore, policymakers also have a role to play here. And that is why I was saying that the media has a great role to do, to play in knowledge brokerage so that we can address these issues. Thank you. I think I've given a few examples that probably are appropriate. If you feel of it, you want to ask something else, then you can do.
No, thanks, Ochieng. I think as you're speaking, I was just thinking around the whole issue of conference of parties, the so-called COPs, yes, which are the theaters of global discussions around matters climate change. And I think the resolutions that come out of here, the nature of discussions, sometimes fly above our heads. And I was just thinking that the examples you give actually give real life examples of issues that are being handled by UNFCCC and United Nations Environmental Program, but also through the bilateral relations between the US and specific African countries and so forth. And thanks, I'm sure, and also this to our audience. Ochieng is available for questions and comments based on his presentation. So you feel welcome. If you are joining us virtually, you can do that via the chat box. But if you're in the room, I think if you raise your hand, my colleagues there, Adam and Judy, can also help identify you. And you can pose your question or indeed make a comment. But now I want to turn to Adam Clayton Powell, who has a question for Ambassador Ray. Over to you.
Hey, first, thank you very much for joining us in person. You have quite a record of addressing this issue, and I have a question based on some things that you've written. But first, I recognize 5 of the partners in these monthly programs at the beginning, but I want to recognize 4 more who I see represented in person and online who may be joining soon. I see Morehouse, Morgan State, Norfolk State, and Bowie State. So we may have 4 more members of our network joining quite soon. Ambassador, one thing that struck me is a paper you wrote on electric power generation and how that is affected by climate change. And we've just seen a very long blackout in Kenya. It's a recurring problem in South Africa almost every day. It's not going to go away. So I wonder if you could just expand on that a bit.
Well, the issue, it's interesting you bring that up, because this afternoon I'll be speaking at the Foreign Service Institute on the South African elections, and power generation is one of the most contentious issues in South Africa for next year's election. That's a difficult one to really address because there are so many variables. I mean, it depends a lot on what the main source of energy for power generation is, and and therefore what the impact of climate change might be. One of the issues that we've been looking at and at FPRI and have had a hard time trying to frame it is how does the developed world, as it's talking to the global South, countries in Africa and other parts of the world that are developing their industries, and we are saying go green when we haven't gone green ourselves, is how do we help these countries develop sources of energy that are sustainable and that are climate friendly. And I think one of the issues needs to be how we do it ourselves here. And so, you know, the problem with you talk about the rolling blackouts and energy problems in Africa. I mean, we have it in parts of the United States where, especially where the power generation depends on fossil fuel plants to generate energy. The energy supplier is contributing to carbon emissions, but the other is because of impacts of storms and other things on the supply chain. You have issues of power plants not being able to function and to provide electricity. And so this is one of those, going back to what I said about the countries in Africa need to get together to develop solutions. The global community needs to get together and come up with a method or methods of power generation that are appropriate to the region and that are climate friendly, that we can all agree on. And the hopes of that happening are don't grow every day. But I mean, it's an existential issue. We need to figure ways to provide the energy needed for development that doesn't, at the same time, as I said to some people I was doing up in Maine recently and had an audience, and someone said, well, you know, you can't cut out fossil fuel use because it will lower our standard of living. My response to that is, what's the point of having a high standard of living if the planet falls apart on you and you die with all that money in your pocket? So it's a really complicated issue, but I think if I could, a simple answer would be, we need to find a way to continue to provide an acceptable standard of living for people without destroying the planet in the process. Now, that answer, there's no one answer to that. I mean, some areas, solar energy is the way to go. I mean, there are parts of this country where you could do 100% solar and it would work. I grew up in East Texas where the sun never stopped shining except when it's raining. Or in Arizona or New Mexico, you have wind energy. You have a lot of possibilities, hydro energy in some places, but this all has to be coordinated. And it can't be one country doing it because, for example, hydro energy involves tapping the rivers, and when you do that, upstream and downstream, you affect your neighbors. That has to be worked out. And I think as Ochieng said, it's a matter of educating people. I mean, we have people in this country who still think that you can get cancer from wind turbines. So, you know, you have to have a way of communicating to the people impacted in a language they can understand and relate to, in order to develop procedures that will get buy-in from the communities, and it has to be down at the lowest possible level. That's not a very good answer, but at this point in the process of trying to figure out solutions to this problem, it's probably the best answer that I could come up with.
I'm looking up at the screen and I see Jeff Garrett, the dean of the USC Marshall School of Business, and the phrase he keeps using over and over again is sustainable development.
Yeah.
We have a number of questions here.
Okay. Thanks very much, Ambassador Ray and Adam, for your input. I think, Ambassador Ray, as you're speaking, a point that came to me is a running thread, a running theme through our other events that we've held across business, peace and security, human rights and democracy, which is that to some extent, Africans see the US as having double standards. And I'm saying this so that perhaps colleagues can also chime in, because we have environmental climate change denialism from one regime to another. And Africans looking towards the US, if they were to consider it a role model, kind of thoroughly get confused. When from one regime to the other, you're talking promotion of conservation of biodiversity, for example, but on the other hand, you're saying let's exploit these resources. And in fact, American companies are heavily involved in places like DRC Congo, and some of those have been accused of not using good environmental policies. I thought I should just put in that, and also note that perhaps one avenue that we can, because we are also here as researchers, even though we have colleagues from think tanks and civil society, but essentially as university people who are interested in researchable projects. We will want to look at perhaps the President's Emergency Plan for Adoption and Resilience, which is the Biden administration's vehicle for matters environment between Africa and the US, launched last year. It could be perhaps an agency or a vehicle that we could look at in terms of its effective and so forth. But at this point, I would like to invite Dan Whitman, who has a question. And after that, anybody else who feels like chiming in, you can just jump in. Thanks. Okay.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Ambassador, and everybody. Ambassador Ray mentions he mentions green and he mentions population. Decades ago, it was kind of an accepted idea that population growth, or what we could call overpopulation, has an adverse effect. And this becomes a cultural problem, I think, when Westerners engage in conversation with Africans and say, have you considered population growth as a source of suffering, of future suffering? It seems to me we passed 7 billion, I think, 6 months ago. More people, more suffering. However, and this is a US-Africa forum, I want to raise the question of how do Western people, what should we think, and how do we express what we think? Because I believe, and I've talked with Africans on the continent about this, they're very gracious, and they stop short of saying, don't tell us how to change our culture. Are you asking this question because you want fewer Africans in the world? You created the problem, you solve it. Now, I care about human suffering, and I want to be part of this dialogue, but I don't want to cross cultural tripwires. So I'm wondering if Ochieng and Bob might have a visceral cultural response to that. Is this a type of dialogue that can take place? Those in the West who see population growth as a factor leading to misery, and those in Africa who believe, as Bob just said, that's a double standard. Can you advise me on this?
Okay, I think I'll let Ochieng go first. That sounds like a tough question, but Ochieng is up to it. Right.
Indeed, it's a very tough question. The truth of the matter is that there has been a mutual mistrust between African population and the Western people when it comes to population growth. I know, for instance, Africa's population now is 1.4 billion, and this is set to double by the year 2050, when Africa may have a quarter of the world's population and almost near half of the young population of the world. So it is true that with population growth, demand for socioeconomic supplies also increases considerably. And this in itself, if not met well, is bound to steepen poverty and cause suffering. But I think one of the biggest things that I can say on this from my own perspective, given my profession, is the fact that there has been a mutual mistrust based on the lack of adequate information that the people can draw from, and they get to know that this is the real issue. I mean, for instance, if you have a place like DRC, which is being exploited pretty much, that's one of the wealthiest countries in Africa, that has been messed up by a lot of foreign interest, and then you take their minerals, you take their wealth, you take their timber away. Of course, people are bound to see you as the big adversary that is just lurking around and waiting to pounce on what they already have. So these are issues that needs to be addressed quite critically. And it's also the issue of the colonial, legacy that has not been addressed. I mean, for instance, if you look at the coups in West Africa now, there's a lot of blame on on France. And these are issues that need to be put on the table and addressed quite openly, so that people talk about it and see a conflict as an opportunity to arrive at better understanding between the different opinions and different factors of life. So I would say that this need to have these things put on the table. If you go to, for instance, the UNFCCC, which is where we have the COPs year in, year out, if you look at the arrangement of those negotiations, then you find that Africa is like an outsider. Whether you talk about technology transfer, whether you talk about compensation for damages caused by the Western world on Africa, and then they don't really want to do that. And I've attended several COPs, and one of the most outstanding COPs I attended was the one that took place in Copenhagen. And if you looked at the whole framework of how it was done, then you'd see a lot of mischief from the powerful boys. And that in itself is not helping the world. That's a matter that needs to be looked into. If you want to really address these issues, then you have to sit on the table, you have to be honest, you have to admit where you've done mistakes, and you have to come up with solutions, and then people will trust you. We need trust based on openness and based on admission of ills that have been done by others, and then we move forward from there. That's what I can say on that one.
Thanks, Ochieng. I suppose, Dan, you posed that question to me as well, and I was trying to evade it, invoking my being moderator, and ran away from it. But I suppose that the whole point here is that we've talked of African population growth as either a youth dividend or a disaster waiting to happen. And from an environmental perspective, it looks like the disaster side of things is not something we're going to wait for too long to start seeing happening in real terms. I think the coups that we're seeing, which are led by generally the younger soldiers, are almost, have a linkage to the Sahel region and the droughts there, and the resource conflicts that kind of exacerbate the situation leading to this conflict. I think the same has been said of a place like Somalia that has not had any stability for nearly how many years now? 30 plus. Since for those of you who are older, since the days of Said Barre, back in the 1990s. And in fact, you remember the Tomahawk saga where the American soldiers were involved there. It was linked to the fact that Somalia has also had continuous, droughts and famines for that long against an expanding population. So while we have always said that Africa's expanding population is good for the world because the rest of the world is an aging population, I think we've seen news from China indicating that for the first time in the recent months, the population dropped below 1.4 billion. And it's going to continue to decelerate. And already we know lots of Northern Europe regions are generally, aged population. And the world has always looked to Africa as a continent where the median age is about 19.5 years as the next pool of human resource, be it people coming to the US or elsewhere in the world to work as experts and so forth. I think therefore, from an environmental perspective, it will appear that unless Africans benefit from the resources they have, the youth bulge linked to environment will be a disastrous matter rather than one that is a boon for the continent. I think the other point you touched on is that for some reason, Africans have been very tenacious with their cultures. And without digressing too much, one of such is the whole area of LGBTQ issues. And of course, that is a digression, but it's just a point I wanted to raise to demonstrate that Africans seem to hang on to what they consider their cultures. And in some respects, where environment is concerned, they were very close to nature. You're thinking the Maasai and the Fulani and these harder communities that lived next to wildlife without undertaking poaching and so forth. But with the expansion of population, these cultures are falling apart as we see the human-wildlife conflict, which has a link to issues of biodiversity and poaching and so forth. So I suppose these are just the couple of points that I'm raising to say that when Americans think of nucleus families, small families as the way to go, Africans still hold that the bigger family you have, the better it is as some kind of security and insurance. More hands help with farming on the farm and things like those. But at the same time, there are pros and cons in the sense that the population bulge that results from that can either be a good thing or a bad thing. And I suppose that will be my intervention. But moving on, I would like now to invite Mr. Sam Fullwood. Maybe you could introduce yourself a bit as you make your comments so that we get to know you. Welcome.
Yeah, I'm Sam Fullwood. I'm a longtime journalist turned academic. And I don't want to be the skunk at the garden party on this, but I had a question that was rather challenging to Mr. Ogodo's comment about the media and public engagement being sort of a solution point. I can't speak to the African situation. It's been decades since I was in Africa. But in the United States, the media is a source of friction in our understanding of what's going on in the country. And I'm a little concerned because public views here are politically charged and expressed through the media. I looked it up just a minute ago, and the Pew report says that something like 50% of Americans don't believe in climate change. And so when you have that, or that human interaction has anything to do with climate change, it raises a question about how we can do anything even in Africa, but let alone in this country, and how that is expressed through media. So I just wanted to challenge just a little bit to hear from the African point of view about whether there's public engagement, whether there's public embrace of the recognition of climate change and the human involvement in that.
Thanks, Sam. I think over to Ochieng, and I think as you respond, Ochieng, I thought maybe an infusion of matters social media also. I think we've been thinking more of conventional media, but with the rise of social media, that might also be an interesting thing to consider. Welcome.
Yeah, I think if I did get you right, the question is whether the media can really promote public engagement on matters or climate change. And you gave an example with the West that the media is seen as promoting friction and probably less trusted, if I may use that one. Basically, if you look at the African context, to a large extent, people still trust the media. And that would be quite evident when you look at the way treat the newspapers early in the morning, the way people are so keen to listen to the news on television sets as well as radios. And there's also a trust that people still have with the legacy media a lot. And therefore, bringing the legacy media into the mix of one of the tools for public engagement, I think is still very relevant in the African context, pretty much. It may not be in the Western world, but in the African context, it's pretty much important. With the World Federation of Science Journalists, I think about 10 years ago or something like, about 7 to 10 years ago, there was a study that was done, and we found that much as in the Western world, science journalism was really on a downward scale, in Africa, there was real growth and there was real embracement of science journalism insofar as it was articulating scientific issues, whether they are health, whether they are agriculture, biodiversity, and so on, innovation, and so on. So I mean, in this context, we still do, and the media still becomes a very critical component in public discourse. And when it comes to policy making in Africa, most of the policymakers tend to go to the media for quick grab of what is happening and also reacting to them, as opposed to maybe even policy briefs that some of them may not even be reading unless they are fed by the technocrats. So my persuasion is that in the African context, the media still has a major role to play in public discourses, in public engagement, and dissemination, in advocacy for that matter. So I think it still have a role to play. And in the context of what we are discussing today, much of what is known in Africa today about climate change, about the environmental destruction, has come from the media to a large extent. And we still can rely on that one. I'm not sure I've given you a good answer, but that's what I have. Unless you still have something that needs more clarification. Thank you.
No, thanks, Ochieng. I think I can also add very briefly that the media landscape on the African continent is slightly different from, at least talking of conventional media, is slightly different from the American media, ecology, in the sense that here in the US, we have right-wing leaning media, we have left-wing leaning media, we have so-called conservative media, we have liberal media. And on the basis of those kind of quote-unquote ideological divisions, you see environmental denialism or environmental climate change kind of promotion, engagement. And for that reason, I don't think we see much of the media on the African continent really pushing the narrative that climate change is a big lie and so forth. And I think my colleague Ochieng can actually also contribute to this. For the most part, most media practitioners on the continent do appreciate that there is such a thing as climate change. And I think the many environmental disasters of the continent, as I think everybody does recognize, the continent has had the highest number of environmental disasters that happen there, people feel them. And so the question of doubting that the world is changing for the worse on a climate change is not a big deal. And I thought that is something I could just add very briefly. But now moving on to Clarissa Myrick Harris. I think is a colleague from a university here. The floor is yours. You can also introduce yourself briefly.
Hello all, how are you? It's good to be here. And I really appreciate this discussion, and I want to be further enlightened. First of all, about the causes of the dramatic climate change in Africa, and why over the decades Africa has been first and most dramatically impacted by climate change across the continent. And then I'd like someone to enlighten me and just help me understand the negative impact of industrial farming, factory farming, on climate change in Africa, on the climate change crisis in Africa, and the role of the West in really facilitating dramatic climate change as a result of industrialization, industrialized farming, and so on. So anyone who can address that, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you. I think over to our speakers, Ochieng and Ambassador Ray. I suppose, Ambassador Ray, you could jump in here to any one of those three questions around the causes of the traumatic climate change matters, onto the impact of industrial farming, and onto the role of the West in all these matters. Over to you, Ambassador Ray. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate getting the easiest question in the morning. There have been studies that show that industrial farming has been one of the major contributors to climate change impacts in Africa. But it's uneven because the location of these industrial farming farms are scattered throughout the continent. I'm not a scientist, so I really can't go into like what are the main drivers of climate change on the African continent. You have I guess you could go back to the wiggle in the Earth's orbit that caused the creation of the Sahara Desert, but the fact that the continent has been severely affected is the main issue. Yes, I think outside influences are involved with a lot of the industrial farming, and we have to take the hit for that and work with the local people to mitigate the impacts. And you know, the issue there is getting people in the West to recognize the problem. I mean, when you can't get more than 50% of the people in the US to agree that human activity causes climate change, getting people who are Americans or Europeans who are investing in these countries and doing things that contribute to climate change is like pushing a rope up a hill. And you first have to get their minds in the right place before you can get them to engage with their local counterparts in any kind of meaningful discussion. And I going back to what Ochieng said about the media. I mean, my time on the African continent, what I observed, the difference I think between the media as an instrument of education there and the media as an instrument of education here is different. Here in the US, the media has become a profit-making enterprise, and it's not just a profit-making enterprise, but it's a profit-making enterprise for the right or the left. And you know, first thing is bottom line. I mean, if you look at, let's take Fox News, for example, a lot of their ideology is based on the fact that they make so much money from it. They're not gonna give up the cash cow. Whereas in most of the African countries that I visited or worked in, the media is seen as an alternative source of information from the government, which in many countries is not trusted. And so there is still a chance of using the media there to educate the public. I am not so sure that we can rely on the media here in the US as an education source, because everyone's already staked out their positions. So it's left to face-to-face interactions. And so somebody mentioned diplomacy as a tool in this, and going to Dan Whitman's comment. I mean, one of the first things that I think we as Westerners or as Americans, and especially American government officials and diplomats, have to learn to do in dealing with this and other issues when we go to places like Africa is learn to listen a lot more than we talk. And instead of going in, whether it's LGBTQ rights or whether it's climate change or whatever, instead of going in talking about what we think needs to be done, we need to go in and listen to what the people are experiencing and what they would like to have done. And this is a roundabout way of going at your question about the industrial farming, rather than going in and pointing a finger and saying industrial farming is bad, stop it, is to go in and find out from the people how they are experiencing it and what they think might be done to make it better. You know, at the end of the day, if you go into say the Congo River Basin where there's an issue with deforestation, you can't go into a farmer who's looking to feed his children and say, stop cutting the trees because it's harming the environment. You need to go in and find out from him what he needs to sustain his family, and then engage him to have him find a way to do that in a way that his grandchildren will still be able to use that same land to sustain themselves. And you never have to mention climate change. You can protect the environment by finding a way to make sure that that environment is there for you and for your generations to come, and you get the same result. And as one of the issues that I always face as a diplomat, rather than going in bluntly as we sometimes do, is go in and find out what people are experiencing and what they need, and then adapt your rhetoric and your actions to help get them there. And I think that's, you know, the whole issue of who's to blame for the climate change is not the issue. The issue is who needs to do what to mitigate the impact. You can blame all you want, but you're not going to change the fact that it's done. What's done is done. Let's find out an effective way to undo it.
Thank you, Ambassador Ray. I think, Larissa, you are getting some perspectives there. Right. And so I'll ask Ochieng to also push in, to also respond to the same issues briefly before we move to Naj out there in LA for his question. Ochieng, do you have anything to add on this issue of the causes of climate change, the role of the West, and perspectives on industrial farming as one of the issues within the broader issue of climate change?
Well, the drivers of climate change, I may not be the best person to respond to that, because it's more of a scientific issue that needs people who have researched pretty much on that one. But I think that issues that are known generally to be drivers of climate change, like deforestation, pretty much depending on fossil fuel, which releases a lot of carbon into the air. So those are known points. But just like the ambassador said, I think we need to move to a situation where we now deal with adaptation and also mitigation. There has been a long discourse over the years on the causes of climate change, who to blame, who should pay who. But I think we need to move a step further and now deal with the real issue. That's, look here, ladies and gentlemen, something has happened. And we have what has happened with that. How do we move from there to the next set of actions that will help us to mitigate and to adapt, and also to address future challenges that may come out of that one? So that's one thing that I think needs to happen. On the issue of industrial farming, in Africa, I don't think we really depend on industrial farming on that big scale. If for instance, in Sub-Saharan Africa, about 60% of the farming is small-scale farming, and we are still very low on mechanized farms. More or less, we are still traditional in the way we till our land, the pieces of lands that we have. So it's not a major issue, but I think the impact can only be from the West, where we have big farms in places like America, maybe places like Canada, and part of the upper developing countries like Brazil that may be having large scale farming that could be responsible for that one. I think in Africa, we only have crop farming, and also we have some livestock farming, but on a peasantry level, and may not be so much of a threat to environment or to climate issues. But in the long run, if we continue with those ones, then they could also have their own percentage of, contribution to the problem that we have. I think that's what I can say on that. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Ochieng. Before we come to Naj, I just wanted to chime in and add the point that one, I think neither am I a scientist on these matters to the courses. I guess in the next session, we'll try and get a proper scientist. But I suppose what we know colloquially or in general terms is that greenhouse emissions are responsible, and greenhouse emissions are essentially the manufacturing plants are responsible for much of global warming, which is a key agent in climate change. And therefore, when we look at that, we see that the countries that are the highest global emitters are led by China in the first position, according to the UNFCCC, followed by the US, followed by India, Russia, then Japan, then Germany, in that order. The highest emitter on from Africa is South Africa, which falls, I'm not too sure about the number, but it's way down the ladder. So if we think of greenhouse emissions as the key cause of climate change, then we are thinking the global north basically as having an impact on the drought in Somalia, in the Sahel, and so forth. I think that's what has led to this whole question of climate justice, where African countries say, according to the Conference of Parties negotiations, that we need compensation, we need support, because we are not emitters, but we are on the receiving end of all that. I think what I will say very briefly about industrial farming, I think I chime in with both Ambassador Ray and my colleague Ogodo to say that Africa is pretty far subsistence, agriculture continent by a great percentage. Most people farm food that they eat. You produce what you eat, and very little sold to the markets. Most countries have been attempting to go industrial, and I think, as Ogodo will tell you, in Kenya there's been an attempt to introduce genetically modified foods, or GMOs, which are now actually well accepted in South Africa, because they are said, and I think GMOs are very well accepted in the US and most of the developed world. But I think Africans have been worried of GMOs because they think that they will affect the biodiversity, because most people plant seeds that are harvested on their land and kept on their land or produced industrially, but not in the GMO fashion. So I think there's been a very big, hue and cry about the introduction of GMOs. Yet on the other hand, GMOs will help solve the food security challenge. I think I will, at that point, I'll stop there and move on to Naj, joining us from LA. Welcome. I think you are on the screen here. You can post your question directly. Right.
Good morning, and thank you very much. I'm Naj Meshkati. I'm a professor of engineering and international relations at USC. I would like to thank my colleague, Professor Adam Paul, and the distinguished panel for this great discussion. Just for your information, I teach a seminar on technology and environment, and also a course which I developed called Engineering Diplomacy. This discussion is very related to my two classes this semester. I have many questions, including one. I heard Ambassador Ray and Mr. Ogodo talk about the issue of adaptation. My question is, what are the specific, and again, I accentuate the specific, what are the specific strategy for adaptation and mitigation of environmental refugees or climate refugees due to the climate change in Africa? And do you expect this issue to be addressed extensively at the upcoming COP28 conference in UAE or not? Thank you.
Sorry, thanks, Naj, and thanks for joining us so early in LA. This is what we call commitment. So to either of our speakers, response to this interesting question. Maybe start with Ambassador Ray, perhaps, or Ochieng, whoever.
I'll go first because I have very little to say.
Sure.
The specific adaptations for the climate refugees, I mentioned looking at the design and redesign of urban areas to take into account in-migration caused by climate change, construction materials and drainage and access to facilities are things that need to be done in order to, in most places when people move from rural to urban areas, they actually experience an increase in living standards. In Africa, it's the reverse. They experience a decrease because they tend to be located in slums that encircle the cities that are constructed of materials that are heat retaining as opposed to reflecting, and so they create urban heat islands. There are issues with drainage and being in floodplains, access to health, education, jobs, and the like. And I would say in most of the countries on the continent, individual countries probably don't have the resources to do what's necessary without external help. Which leads to the question of will this be an issue that will be discussed at the next COP? I'm not a betting person, but if I were betting, I would bet not, because it would mean that the wealthy participants in COP would then have to pony up, and we've seen in these past meetings that basically you have a bunch of tight-fisted people when it comes to spending money to help others. And you're talking about a really substantial investment that would be required. And of course, now now that we've had urban heat island experiences here in the US, I think there might be a bit more sensitivity to it. But again, and I don't want to sound like a pessimist, you're going to have the countries of the global north looking at having to spend to protect their own. And I doubt very seriously if you're going to get very much commitment from the wealthy countries participating in COP to help the poorer countries in the world do much more than cosmetic efforts at mitigating these effects. That's a pessimistic answer, but the truth quite often is unpleasant.
Yeah, the truth is often cynical and pessimistic rather than optimistic, right? So, but Ochieng, also responding to this same question, same comment, any thoughts?
I think I would say that in addressing climate refugees, one of the things that needs to be done in the African context is to make the countryside habitable. I'm saying like that because you will find that a lot of the youth are now migrating from rural areas to towns where they also end up in slums. But the reason is because they don't have amenities in the countryside. You have poor roads, you don't have water. Agriculture is not really beneficial. So even if you do it on a small scale and only for subsistence. So there is always the mentality that once you become a young man, the best thing to do is to go to town and go and look for jobs. So there's need for African government to think of how rural or countryside can be made to hold people instead of being so wild for the people to, especially the young people, so that they can go outside. In some places in Africa, you cannot even get the internet, which is very attractive to the young people. So they would want to go to places where they can access these things. So that is one thing that I think needs to be done. Provide social amenities that can make the countryside attractive. The other thing is creation of jobs. If you look, for instance, why people are dying in the Mediterranean to go to Europe, it's because of lack of job opportunities. And some of the causes of this one is climate change. I moved from my rural home, I come to Nairobi, and I thought Nairobi would be a heaven for myself. And when I reach there, I find it's even so harsh that I can't stay. And then somebody tells me, why don't you go and look for a job in the Middle East, where lots of females from Kenya go to, and then they end up being mistreated. Some of them are killed and come back as corpses. So we need to think about the job situation, and especially given that Africa has a very young population that is growing in numbers terrifically. That needs to be addressed. If we don't address that, or address the causes that are related to climate change, then we are sitting on a time bomb that is going to explode and will be almost very difficult to contain. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Ochieng. I think my own quick addition is that the issue of climate financing remains a big unfulfilled problem, particularly for the African continent. All the promises that have been made by the US, by European countries, by China, through the various COPs have not been fulfilled. And that has been a loss side for African countries. But in fact, if you recall, in late June this year in Paris, there was that climate financing conference that was put together by President Macron. And if you just care to go to YouTube and look up footage from that conference, you will see that almost to every single African president was railing against unfulfilled pledges that have not been made for financing climate change programs on the African continent. And in that whole mix was thrown in the issue of African debt, that African countries are indebted. Their contribution to a common facility for global climate change programs is quite enfeebled, and also tied then to the fact that the great emitters, the causes of all these problems are number one, China, number two, the US, number three, India, and so forth down the line, who therefore should actually bear the responsibility in one way or another. And I think that was just my quick addition there, but we'll move on to Professor Dwight Ellis from Bowie State University.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm a communications professor at Bowie State University. And prior to my becoming a professor, I was an executive with the National Association of Broadcasters, located right here in this building, incidentally. And I wanted to point out something. There's so much that's been said, and the journalists, you apparently are working with the traditional journalists, and traditional journalism is dead. We are now in an era of citizen journalism. Citizen journalism carried out, when you're thinking internationally, largely by digital nomads. Now, I am telling you that of my students, and I teach grad and undergraduate students at Bowie State University, and my students do not watch television. They get their news from you know where they get their news. They don't get it from traditional television. And what I know about Africa, what I've learned about Africa, I've learned from about 15 digital nomads. Some of them African Americans, some of them Africans, a lot of the Europeans who are traveling through the 54 or 56 countries in Africa and telling you and showing you what is happening on the ground. I had no idea, for example, I knew about the malaria issue, but I had no idea what was happening in major companies like Ghana, which is, I believe, number 6 in the production of gold in the world, that the gold mines in Ghana are using so much mercury in the production of gold that the water table of many of the rivers in Ghana in the rural areas are being poisoned by this. I haven't heard anything about that. I learned about that from this Dutch motorcyclist who has 55 million followers. And she's been through about 15 or 20 African countries, and she shows you and she tells you the history about what is going on. I am not hearing that, and we're not getting it from traditional media. And I would suggest to you that citizen journalism, which is very big in this country now, and a lot of the traditional radio and television stations are depending on students who are running around with cell phones and calling in, and it's happening globally. I also have a lot of excellent African students that I'm teaching, a lot from Nigeria. And I say to them, with my little knowledge that I'm learning about African nations and the challenges, I said, why don't you go back? They need you. Go back and help, take care of the corruption or anything else that needs your country. And they say, no, we're going to stay in the United States or we're going to go to Europe. So there's a brain drain happening that was alluded to earlier by someone. The young people are, if they're stuck in Africa, they're not doing what could or should be done to help for the total rehabilitation of those countries there. And I would suggest that we develop many more connections and with digital nomads who are known, and they are known. They're known on YouTube. Students are watching YouTube. They're not watching regular television or even cable. And the research is being taken from programs and channels on YouTube like never before. And now with ChatGPT and the generative AI, what's happening there. I mean, all of the research is going to come from the internet, and it's going to stream through YouTube. So all I wanted to say was, I'm concerned about not what the United States, when I understand what we're doing or not doing in Africa, but what the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese are doing, and all of that mining that's going on in South Africa and Ghana and all these other countries, and people who are basically living agrarian lives. They're farmers. The young people are being drawn from the farmers, from the farms where they would raise their food, and they're saying, and the Europeans are saying, come work at the mines, we'll pay you more money. $5, $3 a month, or $3 a year, or whatever. You don't want to work on the farm. So the young kids are not working on the farms. And young kids want to go to the cities. And so urbanization is taking place. I don't have to tell you what goes on in Lagos. 3 basic sections in Lagos. And I know everyone here knows more than I know about Africa, certainly. But if you don't know, all you need to do is to use your phone or use your television and go on YouTube and look at what these digital nomads are showing, what is happening. The infrastructure, the roads in many of the countries where these large trucks are carrying technology and whatever, can't even get to cities. They're trucks and that are tied up on roads, on mud roads for months because of the infrastructure. So the leaders, the African leaders, they're in a conundrum because the Europeans are saying, look, we will build your infrastructure. We'll build your roads. We'll build your airports, says China, says Germany. Give us the right to mine. We want what is underground. So that's why they're there. That's the reality. I don't know how much the United States is doing in that. But as far as I know, pretty much from what I'm getting from the channels that I hear, China damn near pretty much runs and owns much of Africa or the infrastructure. So, you know, I'm sorry, it's rather frustrating for me because I've learned so much about Africa from YouTube that I had no idea. So I rest my case. Sorry about that.
Thank you. Was there any further quick addition from the floor or before we move to the next speaker? Because as Dwight was speaking, I was reflecting on my own research in the early 2010s, which led me to understanding that the Chinese artisanal mining in Ghana, what is called Galamsey, was quite rampant, and indeed the rivers had been polluted quite in a big deal. But in a twist, most of the artisanal Chinese miners in Ghana came from the province of Fujian, in southeast China, right? Near the strait to Taiwan, and they were actually also fleeing environmental disasters in China itself, and bringing those practices that had led to challenges in China into Ghana. At the same time, in the DRC, as you're talking about trucks, Dwight, I was thinking about the fact that the truth be said, some of the leading and long-running businesses in the mining sector in DRC, for example, have been American companies. These are Anglo Gold, Ashanti companies such as Glencore and so forth. So I think there's a need for some candid discussion there that takes into account the potential in which a candid conversation can be had with American businesses themselves, even in the mix of all this. But I think at this point in time, I believe I can recognize Piwo there from Howard University, just came in. But I think we'll move on to Mr. Bill Simmering, also from the journalistic end of things. It seems to suggest that sooner than later we should have a whole session on media and communication. But Mr. Bill Simmering, please.
Yes, I'm sorry, there's some construction going on here, but I hope you can hear me. I just want to make 2 points. One is that there are many local community radio stations that are dealing with climate change in Africa, and that's because they speak in local languages and they are close to the community, and they're trustworthy more than the state broadcasting. The second point is that with so much gloom and doom kind of about climate change here in the United States, it's dysfunctional because people feel helpless and discouraged. However, if we give people hope and solutions that are also going on, we'll be much more effective. Because just dealing with the dark side, they have no hope and they don't participate.
I think thanks very much for the observation. And again, our speakers, Ambassador Ray and Ochieng, might you want to throw in a follow-up perspective on both Dwight and Mr. Bill's comments? Feel free.
Ochieng, you want to go first this time?
No, I'm Ambassador, you can go.
Oh,
It's all right.
Lord, I knew you were going to say that. I agree with the comments about citizen journalism, but I would offer a caution, and that is that while a lot of these internet influencers are quite well known and really pervasive, not all of them can be trusted to provide information that's actually valid. And particularly in the African context, I would point out, for example, that a young European traveling through Nigeria, depending on how far or how widely he or she ranges, might go through areas where as many as 300 different languages are spoken, and quite often have to then rely on either the few locals who speak their language or just their visual observation and interpretation of what they're seeing. It's not to say that they're not correct or that they're not trying to put out good information. I worked as a journalist for a few years, and I can tell you, when you are a legitimate journalist, it's hard to get it right. When you are a dilettante journalist, I don't want to sound like I'm knocking the internet, but internet influencers are looking for clicks in most cases, and so that has to be taken with a grain of salt. The other issue is local journalism, and that comment about local radio stations is I think not only appropriate for Africa, but for here in the U.S. as well. I mean, one of the crises in journalism here in the U.S. is the demise of local media, the local radio stations, local newspapers, the fact that they can't compete in this dog-eat-dog world of the media industry in the U.S. But having lived in an area where I can remember when I was a kid, our local paper came out twice a week, never exceeded 20 pages, but it was the source of news that had meaning and usefulness to those in my community. And it was about 10 years ago bought out, and it's now part of a conglomerate, and I've read a couple of issues and it's crap. So I totally agree that might be one of the things that should be added to things to mitigate the issue is look for ways to incorporate media nomads and local journalism into an echo environment that is communicating to local communities in ways that they can put to use. Another comment earlier about making the countryside attractive to young people to stay. It was sort of implied in my comment. One of the mitigating factors is to develop sustainable rural development, and again, we could use a heavy dose of that right here in the U.S. as well.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ochieng, do you want to also chime in a bit?
Yeah, just briefly, is that I do appreciate the fact that citizen journalism is gaining ground in Africa, and with the internet, we can't just wish it away. But I think we still have a little stretch to go to get authentic news from citizen journalism in this part of the world. Because there's still exaggeration, there's still a lot of misinformation and disinformation coming from the social media, especially by the influencers. And of course, in certain situations, settling of political scores that makes them to come up with very skewed ideas instead of being a well-moderated thought process that gives you the real happening. So it is a growing thing. It's a global thing, and because of the phones that we have today, that when you have a phone, it's like you have a TV station in your hand, you have a newspaper in your hand, you have all channels almost in one single thing, a camera and what have you. And of course, there's also the ethics part of it. to what extent do the citizen journalism conform to ethics, especially in a place in Africa where we don't have regulations as well as legal systems that guides the operations of citizen journalism. So there's need to think about that, because otherwise it may be a messy situation where we report without ethics, without respecting ethics, and going beyond the board. So that's one thing that I would really say. We need to think about how we can make it more regulated and more acceptable. So that's one thing. The other point is about, somebody mentioned about the rural radios. It is true that there has been a proliferation of vernacular stations all over Africa in different countries, whether it's Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Uganda. And I think we now need to think of how we can make them more effective as instruments of dissemination. I mean, for instance, if you look at science, it is dominated by the dominant economic languages. I mean, for instance, a lot of work is done even within the African context in English, in French, and I think soon it will even be Chinese language. I don't know, Bob, you may know how it's called. So given the fact that these languages are the languages that are used in R&D, most of them do not really explain the African culture, and therefore we lack the words that can be used appropriately in dissemination when you come to vernacular stations. And I think this is something that needs to be treated as an urgent matter and needs to be thought about quite critically, because many people are now depending on these vernacular radio stations. I think that's what I can say on that.
Thanks, Ochieng. I think we have about 17 more minutes to go. And before I call upon a speaker there at the table on the ground there, I just wanted to add that some of the major environmental challenges that have been witnessed on the continent have actually come to light through social media in recent times. I'm thinking, for instance, Exxon, I think it was, or something else, or another company that was involved in the offshore oil prospecting of the Indian coast in South Africa without due environmental impact assessment work. I think they were called out, as we say in South Africa, so much so that actually the exploration came to a stop. In the recent past, and I'm just providing examples where social media has actually played a role in good environmental practices, which can actually be a researchable area. The other example is, last year in Kenya, there was a suggestion that we could go back to mixed farming, where you do farming in the forests. I think it's called, Ogodo might know the proper name, but it's like you go into the forest and plant crops there. But it has always been a pretext for actually cutting down trees in forests. So I think these were issues that were raised by social media, and that plan was shelved, or in fact, it was just discarded. In Uganda, the Chinese have been at it building a dam on the Nile. It's called the Karuma Dam. And, because of flouting certain environmental, rules like diverting river courses and building infrastructure that causes a threat to people downstream, that project actually has delayed. It started in 2011. As of now, it's still in progress because they had to come back to proper environmental matters. And again, Ugandan environmental journalists and activists played a key role. We shall also recall the Inga Dam in the DRC, which is supposed to be the biggest dam, in fact, bigger than the Three Gorges Dam on the Yangtze in China. It has also stalled for concerns about environmental matters, which raises the question of Africans want energy. The Inga Dam, which could have been the biggest, will have helped, but then there are environmental fears, and therefore it's been shelved. And again, it's through social activism. And lastly, I think one will recall the example of the Grand Renaissance Dam, which has actually caused schisms between Ethiopia and Egypt. I suppose recently there was a resumption of talks on the same as recent as last week. And lots of the environmental issues, particularly on the Ethiopian end of things, has also been prosecuted through social media. So I suppose there's a start on the use of media, particularly social media, for advocacy, but I think there's room for more. And having said that, I want now to move on to a speaker on the table. I've been told who's keen and ready to make a contribution. Feel free to make your contribution.
Sure, thank you. Well, I'm just going to give a few comments really. I'm an African international lawyer who's been privileged enough to travel the world and contribute as a policymaker. And really what I'm going to say firstly is that climate change, perhaps in Africa, tends not to be particularly a priority because of the scarcity of thermal energy, the coal. So before we even talk of just energy transition, we're looking at, can we even afford the water or the coal to distribute energy? And as a result, you'll find millennials and Gen Zers look at climate change as a first world problem, because what we are facing at the moment is electricity shortage. We can't even afford the coal and the water to distribute the energy, as I said. Number one. Number two, there are other major political issues and major economic issues. So I'm not necessarily discarding climate change because it is something that has ravaged our environment. You look at South Africa, you look at Zimbabwe. But then how do we convince the populace, the African populace, that it is not any other drought, it is not any other flood like you faced back in the 90s, in the 80s when I was growing up. It is actually climate change, it is here to stay, and if you don't do something about it, it is threatening the habitability of your space. I need to hear more on the issue of poverty and the unavailability of the coal and water, which we use to distribute everyday energy before we even start talking about just energy transition. There's also the issue of the narrative that is created around just energy transition. I'll give South Africa as a case in point, where the CEO of the main SOE, rather state-owned enterprise, Eskom, which is the electricity distributor, resigned over political issues, really. And just the fact that he wasn't given enough area, enough room.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
He wasn't given enough room to decide and move his mandate as the CEO. The issue was when he spoke about just energy transition, it wasn't welcome. And unfortunately, the reality that we face is that there are Western nuances to just energy transition which aren't welcome in Africa. Number one. Number two, because it is a crime-ridden state. What happens to the cartels that were benefiting from energy being distributed and being generated from coal? Because at the end of the day, when those cartels feel threatened, then it becomes a fight for survival. So when you bring in just energy transition, you are taking away their livelihood from them. And it is definitely not safe for whoever is ensuring that the just energy transition happens, and crime only heightens. So these are some issues that really have to be looked into, which are making the just energy transition difficult in Africa, using a few case examples, and climate change really not an idea that is to be entertained. Information dissemination is important, and as Ambassador Charles Ray said, we need to find a way of securing buy-in from the African states. I was going to raise the point of media and academia. Academia is great, number one, but also I think the second option is media, social media. I was thinking that vernacular would be a great start, disseminating information and educating in languages that people understand, because already academia is seen from an elitist perspective. What makes Africa perhaps more vulnerable to climate change, someone asked? I would say the latitudinal extent, geographical issues. You look at the land and sea contrast, and also the ocean currents. These are all issues that come into play, but also it's low adaptability when the climate issues rock the continent. So how can, Ochieng mentioned the economic solutions. I'm thinking of the technological solutions, which are really more infrastructural than anything. Building homes on stilts, crafting barriers around rivers in populated regions, and using seeds and crops that are more resistant to floods. And this speaks of scientific innovation. But where people are currently facing poverty, how much of scientific innovation can take place? Which again goes back to the issue of slow technological adaptability to climate change menaces. So these are my few comments on why climate change and thus just transition energy is not really making traction in Africa. And perhaps the solutions that I've provided can bring about some debate and hopefully implementation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those very well thought out ideas and perspectives. And I suppose I didn't quite get your name, but I guess the colleagues there do have your contact. I suppose because your intervention speaks to academia in a big way. You know, for us academics, where you see a gap in knowledge, in literature, in practices, actually that's a good problem, because then you can encourage students or yourself to undertake studies that, to help fill the gaps.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Primrose Gresham. Right,
fantastic. I'm sure we'll have you on record for further conversations. I'm sure our students will also be very glad to understand that there are these gaps that they can work on for their masters, graduates, PhD research work. And I think the interesting thing as well is that you linked this as environment at the center, but linked to peace and security, health, economics, geopolitics, migration, name it. So I think I will have to ask for Clarissa, colleague Clarissa, to come in again with comments. Then I will ask our speakers, Ambassador Ray and Ochieng, to respond to these two and then wrap up. Clarissa, the floor is yours. Yeah.
Thank you. Just wanted to follow up on my earlier questions comment. And I spoke to perhaps current factors that might be influencing the climate crisis on the continent of Africa. But I think it's so important, though, that we don't have this discussion or perceive the discussion in an ahistorical manner without the absence of an understanding of the role of history and players in history that have impacted the climate crisis. And also, as someone mentioned earlier, it would be important to have scientists, indigenous scientists in particular, involved. They have been doing the work. So they have an understanding of what has caused the changes, what's caused the crisis, the issues on the continent. And it's important to acknowledge, to speak about the role of colonialism and post-colonial exploitation of the continent by the West over the centuries as really being the catalyst for much of the climate crisis going on today. Accountability is important, and there are studies that back it up. I mentioned in the chat one done by the Columbia University Climate School, that can, I can put the link in, and it's easier to Google it and find it. And there have been other studies about that link, the repercussions over the centuries of the forcing. And someone talked about subsistence farming. And yes, that has been a practice in Africa over the centuries, but during the days of colonialism and since, people have been discouraged. There's been a decline. And there are studies that document a decline in subsistence farming throughout the continent of Africa as a result of urbanization, for sure, and also as a result of practices started in the colonial period and continued even unto today, when people are encouraged not to farm, encouraged instead to chop down trees. And then that deforestation over the centuries without actions taken to replace those trees that have been cut. Again, it results in the tremendous, the horrific issues that are going on. So we must acknowledge history, or we repeat it. And we not only acknowledge that history, but demand accountability from those who are the exploiters, in terms of whether the global north wants to help or resolve issues. It's not a matter of whether they might want to contribute or donate or whatever. They owe a debt. And also it's the continent, on the continent of Africa, but this is something that impacts, that reverberates around the globe, as we all know and have all discussed. So that's what I wanted to note. And there are solutions out there. I think we know that, scientists know that. And it's just that those who are exploiting the continent have to be encouraged, and there must be a demand for those solutions to be put in place.
Thanks very much, Larissa. And I suppose a key takeaway from your point is involvement of scientists. I think environment and matters climate change is a great opportunity for the nexus between social scientists and so-called natural scientists or physicists, and guys who are laboratory and field work in the real sense of the word based, so that there's a confluence of interest there. But I suppose I'll hand over this now to Ochieng first, then Ambassador Ray, to respond to Clarissa and this colleague who spoke earlier, and also use this opportunity to make their closing remarks. Then we'll move towards wrap up. Thank you. Ochieng?
Yes, thank you. I think the lawyer talked about so many things, and probably may not be having all of them. But I think one thing that she talked about that did strike me is the issue of technological advancement or transfer, if we may look at it from that point of view. One of the biggest problems with the negotiations that has been going on is on the technology. Do we really have, as Africa, have to walk back to where invention started? Or are we capable of getting technologies transferred to Africa and then adopted appropriately to answer to the problems that we have? And that has been an issue where the global north has been very reluctant. And you talk about protection of, we call what? Where we have patented technology. And these are, for instance, in the Western world, most of the infrastructure are built with climate change impacts at the back of their minds. That is not the case for Africa. We build roads that are easily swept. We build houses that can easily be brought down by these impacts of climate change. So that is something that needs to really be looked at quite critically. And we try to really get, if the world becomes fair, then we need to have an access to these technologies and also adapt them to our situation, or maybe
do our own innovation. Redesigning of these innovations to accommodate the African context. So that is one point that the lady made, which I felt is very important. And as we go on in search of climate change solutions, we need to think that way. Both the advanced countries as well as the countries that are still less advanced compared to them. So I think that is something that is important. Otherwise, in my last remarks is, it has been a very interesting discussion and I've really enjoyed it. And I think I'm still convinced, like I said at the start, the media has a critical role to play. And therefore, I think there's need to have lots of linkages between different segments that are dealing with climate change and the media itself, whether it is in research, whether it is in development, whether it is in innovations, whether it is in economics, indigenous knowledge, which is also equally important. We've not talked about it, but very important in climate change adaptation. We need to do that. Otherwise, thank you so much for having me today, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ochieng. I think you'll hang on until we finish properly. I had a feeling you are now running, knowing that your space there has progressively gotten darker, which I suppose means is getting into the evening in Nairobi, right? But I think over to Ambassador Ray. Yeah.
Thank you. I would just like to end with two things that I hope sort of address some of the issues that were brought up. And one is in terms of developing mitigating strategies to deal with climate change, the one audience that we must not forget is the person on the ground. The people on the ground are often ignored in developing these strategies. And in Africa, that's very important in terms of developing strategies and media and communicating them. And the fact that we here in the US, I know, tend to make assumptions about our messaging when we're talking to countries. And so, you know, if we're in Zimbabwe, we speak English. If we're in Senegal, we speak French. And that ignores the fact that on the continent, I think it's, I don't remember the exact figure, but I think it's less than 25% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa speaks one of the colonial languages at home. Okay, and by that I mean English, French, Portuguese. I guess those are the main three. And furthermore, that on the continent, there are four of those who do speak the colonial languages. There are 4 French speakers for every 1 English speaker. So we need to keep that in mind as we're crafting our messages to the people on the ground, who at the end of the day have to be the ones to implement these strategies, that we have to communicate with them, not just in their language linguistically, but in their language culturally. And the other on this issue of what, you know, what the West should or shouldn't do. You know, I grew up in an area of the country that's sort of oral tradition, and with a grandmother who raised me, who taught me to use stories to get points across to people. And when I've talked to groups here in the U.S. about the U.S. obligation or the Europe's obligation to Africa and why it is, it's not a matter of we should feel guilty about what we've done in the past, the colonialism, the Cold War, or whatever, but we should think of it as the earth is a boat, and we in the global north are in cabin class, but if steerage springs a leak, if we don't do something, we sink too. And that's the message that has to be given to everyone. It's not a matter of moral obligation. It's a matter of the survival of humanity. If we don't help the poor of the global south, of the African continent to survive, ultimately we will not survive.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ray. As you're speaking, I could see my colleague from Center for African Studies at Howard University nodding quite emphatically and in agreement, I believe, because I wish Piwa we had a moment for you to throw in a word, because you are a native or African language specialist. Maybe you can give you an opportunity to just say a word there.
Oh, yes, thanks. I'll take 2 minutes. I'm from South Africa and I'm Zulu. I've just returned there this summer, having taken my American students there for a study abroad. And I was very gratified as we drove throughout KwaZulu-Natal. The Zulu people still build what we call huts, but Zulu architecture. You know, those round houses made of thatches. No matter how prominent someone is, they'll have a big house, but they'll have one small roundabout. As a matter of pride, and I was very happy because more and more people are doing it. These are warm in the winter and cool in the summer. And so much of these, some of these deliverables to deal with the climate change crisis are actually us who are looking into back to the future. So I think there's a lot of humility that could attend some of these approaches from our Western friends and colleagues, whereby indigenous knowledge is not just an abstract term, but it still exists in African places, and we need just to engage some of these people, and people in academia should be able to come down, if I may say it that way, and collaborate across disciplines. Secondly, and lastly, the African languages. I was very happy to hear Sister and Ambassador talk about it. In fact, in South Africa, only 10% of South Africans speak English. Those who've been to South Africa, my people always say, yes, I speak English. But once you speak with them for 10 minutes, you find they're very uncomfortable. I still don't speak English very well, and I have a PhD. In other words, then, maybe the challenge for all of us, or even scholars, is what is climate change in an African language that you know? And we'll just begin right there. That means the women I passed by with a baby on the back in rural KZN, and my students took a picture next to holding a mound, a big clump of wood on her head. Once that woman knows what climate change is in Zulu, we've made, the rubber has hit the road.
Thank you, Piwo. I think you went in, as Ochieng Ogodo's people say, our people on the lake side of Kenya, Lake Victoria, will say, I am also English. To say, they also speak English, but beyond that, it might. But I think the point, the importance and significance of indigenous languages can't be overstated. And without further ado, let me just mention that we have our next event on 25th of September, and here we'll be dealing trade and economics, business relations, Africa-US business relations, which sometimes have a link to matters climate change. And of course, the AGOA is coming up, and there's so many issues. I don't think you can afford to miss our next event. But we don't also just want to, seem to be a talk shop, so that we're done with this event and, we have no further engagement on this topic of climate change. First, we are going to try and transcribe this event so that there's a record of what was discussed. And as we go forward, we invite colleagues from universities, researchers, think tanks, and so forth, to see what we can do together in this respect. It could be an edited volume, it could be think pieces, it could even be thinking of a conference down the line or something like that. And I think that's the whole idea of this engagement, that is not just talk shops, but there are some tangible follow-ups that so that these ideas don't seem to just disappear. But without further ado, I'll now hand over back the program, or the virtual mic, as it were, to Adam Clayton Powell. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. And we're running over, so I'll try to keep my closing remarks to 60 seconds. First, on language, joined by Voice of America, and I think few people in the United States realize that VOA has one of its largest audiences in VOA Hausa in Africa. And Voice of America is much of their audience is thought of as something from the Cold War, something Russia and China. Some of the biggest audiences of Voice of America are in Africa. Second, on media, looking around in gallery view here, I see some familiar faces and voices. I see Georges Collinet, Afropop Worldwide. Thank you for joining us. Joyce Davis, who covered Africa for National Public Radio. Thank you for joining us. Let's see, here we have Ben Davis, former executive producer at NPR. We have Bill Simmering, who spoke earlier, the bee in the red square in the gallery view. He created All Things Considered back in the day. Let's see, President Bill Davis. Kojo Namdi. He's dropped off, but Kojo was on by phone. So we had quite a turnout from public broadcasting. But please join me in thanking our moderator, Bob Wekesa, our speakers, including Ambassador Charles Ray. Ambassador Ray, I think you are our first speaker in this series who is a USC alum.
Yeah.
So thank you to everyone joining us. Thank you especially for those joining us from Africa. And until September 25th, we're adjourned.